The room went completely silent. 5 powerful Navy SEALs, men who had survived firefights, explosions, and missions most people would never even hear about, now stood frozen, staring at the little girl by the doorway. Her words echoed in the room. My father had that tattoo. For a moment, nobody spoke. Chief Marcus Hale's tattoo was not something ordinary. The trident wrapped with a thin rope was a symbol only a few men carried. It represented loyalty, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Marcus had earned it after one of the hardest missions their team had ever faced. And Marcus had died a hero. 3 years ago, one of the SEALs, Lieutenant Carter, slowly stood up from his chair. His eyes moved from the girl to the woman beside her. The woman looked embarrassed and nervous. I'm really sorry, she said quickly. I work here. I was just finishing my shift. She must have seen the tattoo and... But Carter gently raised his hand. It's okay, he said calmly. Then he turned back to the girl. What's your name? He asked softly. Maya, she replied. She didn't look scared, just curious. Another SEAL, Jackson, stepped closer. His voice was careful. Sweetheart, are you sure about what you said? Maya nodded immediately. Yes, my daddy had that same mark on his arm. The men exchanged uneasy looks. Marcus had been private about his personal life. He never talked much about family, except for his younger sister who lived in another state. None of them had ever heard him mention a child. Carter crouched down, so he was at Maya's eye level. Do you remember your father's name? He asked gently. The girl thought for a moment. My mommy says his name was Marcus. The air in the room felt even heavier. Jackson exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck. That couldn't be a coincidence. Carter looked up at Maya's mother. What's your name? He asked. Denise, she said quietly. She looked overwhelmed by the sudden attention. I never wanted to cause trouble, she added quickly. Marcus and I, we knew each other years ago, but he had to leave for deployment, and after that, I never saw him again. The SEALs felt their hearts sink. Denise continued, her voice shaking slightly. I didn't even know what happened to him until I saw the memorial picture here today. She glanced toward the table where Marcus's photo stood among candles and medals. Maya looked at the picture too. That's him, she said softly. That's my daddy. No one in the room doubted it anymore. The resemblance was suddenly obvious. The same determined eyes, the same strong jawline. Marcus Hale had a daughter, and he never knew. The men felt a deep ache in their chests. They had fought beside Marcus, trusted him with their lives, yet none of them had known this part of his story. Jackson slowly walked over to the table and picked up Marcus's framed photograph. He looked at it for a long moment. You stubborn guy, he murmured quietly. You kept this secret from us. Then he turned back to Maya. A gentle smile appeared on his face. Well, kid, he said, kneeling beside Carter, if Marcus Hale was your father, he glanced at the other SEALs. Then that means something very important. The other men nodded silently. Jackson looked back at Maya. It means, he said softly, you're family to all of us now. Denise swallowed nervously as she followed Commander Briggs to the other side of the room. The other SEALs stayed quiet, watching the situation carefully. They weren't angry. They were simply trying to understand something that suddenly felt very important. Maya stood close to her mother, holding the edge of her uniform. Commander Briggs spoke gently. Ma'am, please don't feel pressured, he said. We just want to understand. Marcus Hale was one of our closest brothers. Denise looked at the photo on the table. Marcus stood there in uniform, smiling the same way she remembered. Her eyes softened with emotion. We met almost 9 years ago, she said quietly. It was before one of his deployments. He came to this clubhouse with his team. I had just started working here. One of the SEALs, Jackson, crossed his arms thoughtfully, but listened closely. Denise continued. Marcus was different from most people who came here. He always treated everyone with respect, even the staff. We talked a few times when I was cleaning after closing. She paused, remembering those evenings. He told me about the ocean, about training, about how much he trusted the men on his team. The SEALs exchanged silent glances. That sounded exactly like Marcus. Denise sighed softly. One night we talked for hours. He told me he might be leaving soon for a long mission. Her voice grew quieter. And then he did. Commander Briggs nodded slowly. He knew how suddenly deployments could happen. Did Marcus know about Maya? Briggs asked gently. Denise looked down at her daughter and shook her head. No, she said honestly. I didn't know I was pregnant until months after he left. The room fell quiet again. One of the SEALs leaned against the table, staring at Marcus's photo like he was trying to imagine how his friend would react to this news. Denise continued, her voice trembling slightly. I tried to find him later, but all I knew was his first name and that he was a Navy SEAL. There was no way to reach him. She looked around the room, and then life moved on. I raised Maya by myself. Maya looked up curiously. My mom says my daddy was brave, she said proudly. Several of the SEALs felt their throats tighten. Commander Briggs crouched down so he was closer to Maya's height. Your mom is right, he said gently. Your dad was one of the bravest men we ever knew. Maya smiled a little. Did you know him? She asked. Briggs chuckled softly. Yeah, he said. We knew him very well. Jackson stepped forward and looked at Denise. You said Maya recognized the tattoo, he said. Denise nodded. When she was little, Marcus lifted her once before he left. His sleeve rolled up and she touched the tattoo. I guess she remembered it. Jackson rubbed his chin thoughtfully. That tattoo means something special to our team, he said quietly. The men stood silently for a moment. Finally, Commander Briggs stood up again. He looked at the other SEALs, and they all seemed to come to the same silent decision. Then Briggs turned back to Denise. Ma'am, he said respectfully, Marcus was more than just our teammate. He gestured toward the group behind him. He was our family. Then he looked at Maya, who was staring at Marcus's photo. And if Maya is Marcus's daughter, Briggs said firmly, then she's family too. The other SEALs nodded without hesitation. For the first time since walking into the room, Denise didn't look nervous anymore. She looked relieved, because she realized that Marcus's brothers weren't questioning her. They were welcoming them. The table remained quiet after Maya's words. The SEALs looked at one another, each of them thinking about Marcus. They could almost hear his voice again, calm, steady, always confident. He had always spoken proudly about his team, calling them brothers more than once. Commander Briggs leaned back slightly in his chair and let out a slow breath. That sounds like Marcus, he said softly. Denise wiped the corner of her eyes and tried to smile. He always spoke about loyalty, she added. He said the men he worked with trusted each other with their lives. Jackson nodded immediately. That's exactly how it was, he said. For a moment, the men seemed lost in their memories. They remembered training together, long missions, and nights when Marcus had kept everyone calm in dangerous situations. Then Briggs leaned forward and looked at Maya. Do you remember anything else about your dad? He asked kindly. Maya thought carefully. He had big arms, she said, stretching her hands wide to show how strong she thought he was. And he smelled like the ocean. The men chuckled softly. Marcus had always loved the water. Whenever the team returned from a mission, he would talk about diving and the sea like it was his second home. Maya continued happily. He told me stories about brave men who never left each other behind. Jackson glanced at the others. Marcus had been telling her stories about them. That realization hit the group harder than they expected. Denise looked a little embarrassed. I didn't realize how important those stories were, she admitted. I thought they were just bedtime stories. They weren't just stories, Briggs said gently. He gestured toward the group of men around the table. That was his life. Another SEAL, Ramirez, spoke for the first time. Marcus saved my life once, he said quietly. Denise looked up surprised. It was during a mission overseas, Ramirez explained. Things went bad, really bad. I was pinned down and couldn't move. He paused before continuing. Marcus ran straight into the line of fire to pull me out. The table went silent again. Ramirez gave a small, emotional smile toward Maya. That's the kind of man your dad was. Maya listened carefully, her eyes wide with curiosity. So, he was a superhero, she asked. The men smiled at the innocent question. Something like that, Jackson said warmly. Briggs leaned his elbows on the table. Marcus never liked attention, he explained. He believed the whole team deserved credit, not just one person. Denise nodded slowly. That sounds like him, she said. Then she looked around the room at the 5 men sitting there. For years, I thought Maya and I were the only ones who remembered him. Her voice trembled slightly. but now I see something different. She looked toward the photos on the memorial table. You all carry his memory too. Briggs followed her gaze toward Marcus's picture. Every single day, he replied. Then he turned back to Maya. Your father trusted us with his life, he said. Maya looked at the group curiously. Does that mean you were his team? She asked. Briggs smiled gently. Yes, he answered. Maya looked around the table again, studying each face like she was meeting new relatives. Then she said something that made everyone pause. My daddy said if I ever met his friends. She smiled softly. I should tell them thank you for keeping him safe. The seals looked at each other again, their eyes filled with emotion, because they all knew the truth. Marcus had trusted them, and now, in a way none of them expected, he had left something even more important in their care. For a few seconds after Maya spoke, the room was filled with a strange mix of laughter and emotion. The 5 seals looked at one another, shaking their heads in disbelief. That was Marcus, Jackson said, chuckling as he wiped the corner of his eye. Always thinking ahead. Commander Briggs was still holding the photograph carefully in his hands. He studied it closely, almost like he was seeing a hidden part of his friend's life for the very first time. Marcus looked younger in the picture, relaxed and happy. His arm was wrapped around little Maya, who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. She was laughing, her tiny hands grabbing his shirt. Briggs smiled softly. I don't think I ever saw him look this happy, he admitted. Denise looked at the picture too. That day was the last time he visited, she said quietly. He told Maya he might be gone for a while. The men listened in silence. He held her for a long time before leaving. Denise continued. Like he didn't want to let go. Jackson leaned back in his chair. Marcus always had that feeling before missions, he said. Like he was preparing for anything. Maya tilted her head curiously. What's a mission? She asked. The men exchanged careful glances. Briggs answered gently. It's when soldiers go somewhere important to help people and protect others. Maya seemed satisfied with that answer. Oh, she said simply. She then pointed at the photo. My daddy said those marks on his arm meant his friends were very brave. Ramirez smiled warmly. That's not exactly what the tattoo means, he said. But he wasn't wrong. The group sat quietly for a moment, looking at the picture again. Marcus had been their teammate, their brother in battle. They had shared danger, victories, and losses together. But this photograph showed something none of them had ever seen. A different side of him. A father. Jackson suddenly leaned forward. You know, he said thoughtfully, Marcus once told me something during training. The others looked at him. He said if anything ever happened to him, the only thing he worried about was the people he loved. Briggs nodded slowly. That sounds like him. Denise folded her hands nervously. I never expected any of this today, she admitted. We just came here so I could finish my shift. Maya was now looking around the room at all the large men in uniforms and jackets. So, you my daddy's friends? She asked again. Ramirez smiled. Yeah, he said. We are. Maya thought about that for a moment. Then she asked an innocent question. Does that mean you knew his favorite ice cream? The men laughed again. Jackson snapped his fingers immediately. Chocolate chip, he said confidently. Briggs shook his head. No way. It was vanilla. Ramirez grinned. You're both wrong. It was cookies and cream. Maya giggled at the sudden argument. Denise smiled for the first time that afternoon. The heavy sadness in the room had started to lift. Briggs carefully placed a photo back on the table in front of Maya. Then he looked around at his team. For the first time since they had gathered to remember Marcus, the mood had changed. They weren't just remembering their fallen brother anymore. They had discovered a piece of him that was still here, still alive. Briggs looked back at Maya and smiled warmly. Well, kid, he said, looks like we've got a lot more stories about your dad to share. For a long moment after the drawing was handed over, no one spoke. The 5 seals stood there quietly, looking down at the simple piece of paper. 6 stick figures, 5 tall ones, and 1 small one standing proudly in the middle. To anyone else, it might have looked like an ordinary child's drawing, but to them, it felt priceless. Jackson held the paper carefully, almost like it could tear if he moved too fast. Well, he said with a soft laugh, this might be the most important mission assignment we've ever received. The others chuckled, understanding exactly what he meant. Maya looked up at them with bright eyes. Do you like it? She asked. Ramirez crouched down beside her and nodded. We love it, he said warmly. In fact, I think this is going on my wall. Maya grinned proudly. Denise stood nearby, watching the scene unfold. She hadn't expected this when she walked into the clubhouse that afternoon. What started as a simple workday had turned into something much more meaningful. Commander Briggs looked down at the small coin now resting in Maya's hand. That coin, he explained gently, is something SEALs give to people they trust and respect. Maya turned it over in her fingers, studying the engraved trident symbol. It's shiny, she said happily. Briggs smiled. It also means you'll always have friends looking out for you. Jackson nodded in agreement. Your dad watched our backs for years, he added. Now it's our turn to watch yours. Maya thought about that for a moment. Then she asked another innocent question. Does that mean you'll come to my birthday? The men laughed again. Briggs raised his hand dramatically. Kid, if 5 Navy SEALs show up to your birthday party, it might scare the other kids. Maya giggled. I wouldn't be scared. Good, Ramirez said with a grin. Because we might bring cake. Denise couldn't help but laugh softly too. The tension and sadness she had felt earlier were slowly fading. For years, she had worried that Maya would grow up never truly knowing her father. But now she was watching Marcus's brothers welcome her daughter like family. Briggs turned toward the memorial table where Marcus's photograph stood surrounded by candles and medals. He walked over and picked up the frame. For a moment, he simply looked at it. You kept this secret from us, he said quietly to the photo. Jackson stepped beside him. He probably thought he was protecting them, he said. Briggs nodded. That sounds like Marcus. He placed the photo back on the table carefully. Then the 5 men walked back toward Maya and Denise. Briggs extended his hand respectfully to Denise. If you're okay with it, he said, we'd like to stay in touch. Denise looked at the group of men standing in front of her. She could see the honesty in their eyes. I'd like that, she said. Maya suddenly jumped up from her chair. Wait, she said excitedly. She ran over to the memorial table and looked at Marcus's picture. Then she waved at it. Bye, Daddy, she said cheerfully. I found your friends. The SEALs felt their chests tighten at those words. But this time, the feeling wasn't just sadness. It was something warmer. Because as they walked out of the clubhouse together, Maya holding the challenge coin tightly in her hand, the men realized something important. Marcus Hale was gone, but his legacy wasn't. It was standing right beside them.